pals, I'm here today to talk about the 14 books I read in the month of January. I've moved myself slightly because it's very grey and snowy here at the moment, and so I needed to get closer to the window for the light. So you can see Albus's teepee. Sadly he's not in it right now, but you can probably see half of his fur left behind in it because he is very messy. So I am going to talk predominantly about 9 of the 14 books I read in January, because the other 5 I'm going to do a couple of separate videos on. So I'll just briefly touch on those books so that you know I'll be talking about them somewhere different. I'm going to be doing a video very soon on like recent releases that I read and what my thoughts are on them, and 2 of the books that I read in January will be featured in that video. One of them is the very buzzy Memorial by Bryan, which you've probably heard a lot about. I ended up giving this one 2 stars, so I wasn't a massive fan. And then the other one is A Room Called Earth by Madeleine, and I ended up giving this one 5 stars. I absolutely loved it, as you can tell by all the tabs. So I'm very excited to chat to you all about it in the upcoming video. And then these next 3, I was doing a reading vlog for my Patreons where I focused on 3 historical fiction books set in 1950s England, because I just happened to have 2 out from the library and another one on my shelves. And I did film that reading vlog, but it was so ridiculously long, so in the end I uploaded a different reading vlog to my Patreon, which is always linked down below if you're interested. But I did still read these books and really enjoyed them, and so I am going to talk about these 3 in a separate review video. So they are The River Within by Powell, which I gave 3.5 stars. It was kindly sent to me by the publisher Europa Editions. And then This Lovely City by Louise, Hare, which I really enjoyed and gave 4 stars. And then Small Pleasures by Clare, which I loved and gave 4.5 stars. And this actually has 25 people waiting behind me at the library for it, but I obviously can't return it because we're in lockdown, so I feel very guilty, but also very excited for those 25 people when they do get to read it, because it is brilliant. So yeah, I'll talk about those in a video probably coming in the next week or so. Then I read 3 sort of fantasy books, 1 adult, 1 YA and 1 middle grade, so I will talk about those 3 next. This one, The Lost Queen by Signe Pike, is the first book in what I think will be a trilogy. This is going to be hard to describe. So this is set in 550 AD. We follow a young girl called Langareth and her twin brother Lailakin. They're both real people who actually existed, and Langareth did become a queen of what was not called Scotland at the time, but is in the location of what we now call Scotland. And her twin brother Lailakin was a druid and is thought to be the man Merlin was based on. So there are lots of scholars who believe that rather than Merlin being someone who lived in Wales and was completely made up, that he was actually a man who lived in Scotland and was based on somebody real. And the reason it's thought to be like a Welsh tale is because lots of the people who lived in Scotland in 550 AD, then when they fled and moved, a lot of them ended up in Wales and I think Cornwall. So I find the history of this fascinating. I picked this up because the author's writing was compared to Juliet Marillier, and that it's historical fantasy with a strong element of romance. And I do really see the comparison. There's definitely less fantasy because this is entirely based on their belief system. So these people just believed in prophecy. You know, they believed if they saw 3 crows at the same time it meant something. If they saw a deer in the forest it meant something. So it's not fantastical, it's just their belief system. But it has as much romance and not dealt with as well as Juliet Marillier. So beautiful nature writing, I love that. Really slow paced, good character development I felt, and there's a much more commentary in this on politics and the movement of the military than there is in Juliet Marillier's books. But the romance I felt really let this down for me. So I loved the first chunk because it was based on Langareth when she was a young girl, but then when she becomes around 15 there's an insta-love which really annoyed me, and then I felt some of her decisions following that insta-love were a bit frustrating. But then I really enjoyed the last chunk when she's an older woman, you know, this jumps through the years of her life, and I'm not sure if the next book will then follow her children or whether it will follow her into old age, I'm unsure. So yeah, I really enjoyed this in some parts, but I think a lot of my enjoyment was based on the fact that I just find this history itself fascinating. So do please feel free to recommend me books, like non-fiction books, about Britain around this time. This would have been 5th, 6th century, I guess, because yeah, there's so much I don't know, and I found it really interesting, in particular because these people didn't view themselves as Scottish. These people who live close to the Scottish capital of Edinburgh truly didn't see themselves as Scottish, and actually like battled with the Scottish at some point. So it's just really a fascinating history. And I gave this 3.5 stars in the end. I think it's really beautifully written. I really like the pace of everything but the romance. So I think I'll carry on, but I don't think I'll be rushing to carry on as much as I hoped I would. Then we have the YA fantasy, and that is Havenfall by Sara, Holland. This is a library book, as you can see, and I just really like the cover of this, pretty much why I picked it up. Mixed feelings. So this is a contemporary YA fantasy. We open with our protagonist Maddie, who's a 17-year-old girl, getting on a bus to travel to the Colorado mountains where her uncle runs an inn. All sounds pretty normal, except for the fact that this inn, Havenfall, is the portal between many magical worlds, and the role of the innkeeper is to basically act as like the head of the United Nations and make sure all these different worlds that have once been at war with one another remain at peace. And when Maddie arrives at the inn, shit immediately kicks off, and her uncle is found unconscious, a dead body is discovered, and one of the more dangerous portals is found open, and she has to take over as innkeeper and try and like piece together all the mystery. Mixed bag. I felt that some of the descriptions of the portal worlds were beautiful, but it didn't really go past that. You know, this is going to be a series, I'm assuming that in the later books you'll perhaps step into some of those portal worlds, and maybe it'll be a better novel for it, I'm not sure. Found that all the characters were completely undeveloped. Maddie's pretty frustrating. She makes really bad decisions all the time. And there's sort of a love triangle going on, which isn't too over the top, but it's fairly obvious from the get-go. And yeah, for a YA fantasy, I found this a bit of a slog. Like about halfway through, I was thinking, do you know what, I'm only finishing this like for the sake of finishing it. Wasn't really that bothered. So yeah, just a bit of a mixed bag. This could be one where if I saw the next book in the library at a time when I felt like I wanted an easy read, I might give it a go, but I'm not really that bothered. So I gave this, I think, about 2.5 stars. Then the children's fantasy book, I listened to this one on audio, and that is Tilly and the Bookwanderers, which is by Anna James and is the first book in a series called Pages & Co. I'm sure lots of you have heard of this. We follow Tilly. She lives in a bookshop with her grandparents, and she discovers very early on in the book that she has the ability to book wander, which means she can step into magical worlds and interact with the characters in books. Now, oddly, I enjoyed all the non-magical elements of this book. I liked her relationship with her grandparents. She makes friends with a young boy from her school whose mother runs the bakery across the road, and I thought that interaction was really good. All the descriptions of her just reading and having like cosy hot chocolate with her grandparents I liked, but I didn't really like any of the elements of the actual book wandering. And in large part that's because I mentioned this in a currently reading video on Patreon, and one of my patrons very kindly said that Anna had to use books that were out of copyright. She couldn't just use any books, and I felt that, you know, the books that are used here, A Little Princess, Alice in Wonderland and Anne of Green Gables and Treasure Island are all very old white books, and a few of them, like in particular A Little Princess, which is like the main focus of this story, doesn't have great connotations for like the British Empire and imperialism and all those things. And like as an adult reader, I couldn't step away from that, and I was just thinking, God, like I would love this book so much more if there wasn't the copyright issue and Anna was able to just like use any story, particularly stories that don't have like lots of issues with them, for a contemporary reader. So I enjoyed this one, but as an adult I just couldn't step away from those things, so I probably won't be carrying on with the series. And then we have a book that came out last year that I was very intrigued by, and I haven't heard anyone on BookTube review this one, and in the end I just caved and bought it anyway, and that is How to Belong by Sarah Franklin. It's got a very beautiful cover. So the description of this made me think I could really love this book. This is set in a contemporary village near the Forest of Dean, and we follow two women who together sort of represent the sort of effects of a rapidly changing world on remote rural communities. So one of our characters is a lawyer based in London, and she hates her job, she's not really happy with her life, so she decides to go back home to her village to try and run her parents' butchers. They're trying to like sell the butchers, and she convinces them to let her take it on and try and run it. And she rents a room from Tessa, who is the local farrier. And we find out quite quickly that Tessa has this sort of mysterious illness that she doesn't really understand, where whenever anything emotional comes up for her, she collapses and blacks out, and it means that she has to lead this really quiet, private life. The novel flips from each of their perspectives. They get like a chapter each. And I enjoyed the setup of this. I enjoyed the descriptions of the area, the commentary on, you know, in particular Tessa is a queer woman and how she has to lead this really private life in this small community, and when she starts a relationship with a woman who's from a city, like how differently they view being a queer woman in contemporary times. So yeah, I liked a lot of that, but I felt that when it got to the actual plot, it just wasn't as strong. So I definitely enjoyed the first half more than the second. I ended up giving this 3 stars, and I would say that I would maybe pick up another book by this author, depending on like how intriguing it sounded, that I would definitely pick up a short story collection by her, because I think she excels in like beautiful writing, descriptions, but actually her plot and her character development isn't all that great, and I found both the characters a little bit irritating. So yeah, I enjoyed this one, but I didn't love it. And then we have a reread. I loved this book the first time I read it 2 years ago, I think, or maybe, I think it was one of my favourite books of 2019, and I loved it just as much on a second read, and that is Good Talk, A Memoir and Conversations by Mira Jacob. This is phenomenal. Mira Jacob, her parents moved from India to the US and raised her and her brother there, and she marries a white Jewish man, and the memoir is focused a lot on her conversations with her son and how he feels being a mixed race child growing up in contemporary America, and it follows the period when Trump wins and becomes president, with a particular focus on the fact that her white parents-in-law vote for Trump, and there's sort of this big family fallout. I loved this. There's so much excellent commentary on her childhood, on what it was like for her family to move to America, what it's like for her now to be in a mixed race relationship with a mixed race child, and trying to guide him through all the commentary on the news about that. And I love the way this is illustrated. So basically she uses photos and maps, and then she draws all of her sort of family members and the people involved in the story and puts these speech bubbles, and I just think it's a really beautiful way to articulate really difficult conversations. I would highly recommend this to anyone. It's a 5-star read. It's like, I love graphic non-fiction, and this is the best graphic non-fiction book I've ever read, so I would definitely recommend that you pick it up. The next one is an essay collection, and that is Thick and Other Essays by Tressie, McMillan, Cottom. I listened to this on audio with Tressie narrating it whilst I read it, and I've never done that before, and it really worked for me because I found this book pretty challenging. It's incredibly clear that Tressie is incredibly intelligent, and I had to like pause to reread the words on the page quite a lot, but I also really enjoyed her delivery, because whilst this is about really important topics and it is pretty intellectual, she's also really funny, so it's just really great to hear her voice read this book. So Tressie is a professor with a particular focus on the intersection of race, gender and class, and so that is what these essays predominantly focus on. But as well as commentary on the social and political, there is a big focus on the personal, and in fact one of the essays talks about the fact that a lot of people of colour who have now been given voices in newspapers and online media are only ever given voices when they're talking about the personal, and they're expected to talk about their struggles as a person of colour, and never really expected to get the job if it isn't talking about the personal and it's just talking about the political and the social. So I found that really interesting, and she weaves that through each of the essays. One of the essays in particular is speaking about the idea of beauty, and I still don't completely understand what she was trying to say. I'd have to read this book a couple of times over, but I found it really fascinating, and I loved what she was, like what I understood of what she was saying. So I wouldn't recommend this book as like your first step into intersectional feminism, because it's definitely not an introductory read, but I would certainly recommend it for people who have, you know, read a few books about it and want to read a book that is a bit more challenging, because like I said, I was really glad to read this because I felt like a lot of the books that I had read I'd enjoyed, but I felt like I was ready to sort of read books that went a bit deeper, went a bit more niche into certain topics and challenged me a lot more, and this one certainly did that. I gave this one 4 stars, I really enjoyed it and I'd highly recommend it. The next book I have is 7 Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. So Tanya Talaga is an Anishinaabe woman who works as an investigative journalist in Canada, and this focuses on the 7 deaths of high school students in Thunder Bay, Ontario from the years 2000 to 2011. And this book is wide focused as well as narrow focused. So for example, each of the students gets their own chapter at which you follow their history of how they moved from a remote Indigenous community to Thunder Bay, Ontario to access this high school, and then you follow the moments of their death, the investigation and how it affects their family afterwards. So it's close focus in that regard, but it's also very wide focus in that the author has done a ton of research into residential schools, the history of residential schools and how the impact and the legacy of residential schools still remains, because in areas, particularly areas like Ontario, where a lot of these Indigenous communities are very small and very rural, the government won't provide high schools for them because the government says there's too few of you for us to do this. And also the government is racist and just doesn't care about providing the same level of education to Indigenous children as it does to white children. So what was really interesting about, well, there's plenty of things that were really interesting about this, but one of the things I found particularly fascinating was that the high school all these students actually go to is a high school run by Indigenous communities, by the government failing Indigenous communities. It doesn't give the resources or the help to Indigenous run schools that it should, and so these Indigenous run schools can't really be expected to do anything other than fail these children. You know, the setup just doesn't work. So how it works is that if these Indigenous children in Ontario want to go to high school, they have to travel, to move away from their families, and lots of them do go to the high school in Thunder Bay, and they then have to live, they have to board with people who have registered as boarders, and in pretty much all these circumstances, the boarders, whether they're distant relations or no relation at all, don't really act like parents, and contractually they're not expected to act like parents. So these children come from these remote communities where they didn't really, you know, have access to alcohol easily, and suddenly they're not really being watched, nobody really cares what time they get home, and there's nothing to do, and they're obviously treated awfully by the community. They deal with a lot of racism, and so, you know, an awful lot of these children were found drowned in the river in Thunder Bay, and their deaths were never properly investigated, but it's you know, pretty obvious that these children were not didn't choose to go into the water, right? Because a lot of these children were really strong swimmers and just wouldn't have drowned by themselves. And also a lot of alcohol is involved in the deaths of these children, so some of them die from too much alcohol, and you know, even the ones by the water were drinking there. So there's just an immense amount of neglect that comes from the history of Canada, and from the government's just disregard for Indigenous communities, and you can see all the tabs. This book is super informative. You know, for me, what I didn't love about this book, that I think a lot of people will love, is that it reads in a lot of ways like narrative non-fiction. So when Tanya focuses on each of the children, she writes like in the present about like they're now walking out of the house in these clothes and they walk towards the water and they buy this amount of alcohol. When I read sort of investigative non-fiction, I prefer when the author just acknowledges their sources and says, you know, this person told me this happened, and I spoke to this person and they told me this happened, and I just prefer the acknowledgement rather than sort of making it into a narrative. But I think a lot of people will prefer that because it probably is more accessible for a lot of readers. So I know Tanya Talaga has some other books out which I'll definitely pick up. I'd highly recommend this. I gave it 4.5 stars. And then I have 2 memoirs I want to talk about, and the first one is Unicorn, the memoir of a Muslim drag queen by Amrou Al-Kadhi. I listened to this on audio and I highly recommend that because Amrou narrates it and they narrate it beautifully. So this book is, I guess, a coming of age story. We follow Amrou as a young child growing up and idolising their mother, and there's beautiful writing in regards to femininity and the woman in the Muslim community who surrounded Amrou. Thought that was beautiful. And then you follow as Amrou starts to be aware that their queerness isn't going to be accepted by the Muslim community, particularly by their parents, and Amrou becomes obsessed with achieving sort of academic success, because Amrou believes that if they are perfect in that regard, their parents may accept other things about them. So this is both a really emotional read, but also really heartwarming and quite funny. Amrou's a really funny person, and I really love listening to it on audio in that regard, because I think humour just comes across really well when you get to hear the person read it themselves. So Amrou then goes to Eton and then on to Cambridge, and you know, there's some really difficult things that happen in this book to do with the way Amrou was treated by others. And there's a lot of interesting commentary on how institutions such as Eton and Cambridge sort of breed this community of ignorance and all forms of discrimination, and it's really hard to listen to those sections and wonder how anyone who wasn't straight, white and male would like come out of that type of community and not absolutely hate themselves, which is where Amrou ends up for a good portion of the memoir. What I also enjoyed about this is that it isn't just commentary on the homophobia and Islamophobia that Amrou receives from others, but also the internalised homophobia and Islamophobia. Amrou acknowledges that for a good portion of their lives they were very Islamophobic, and it wasn't really until they managed to start a drag society and then start to incorporate their faith into their drag routine that they stopped feeling sort of hatred towards their religion and the community behind that. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I think, like I said, it's really funny, but also deals with really difficult topics, and I'd highly recommend it. If you haven't given memoir a go on audio before, I think this is a good one to start with. I really enjoyed it and I gave it 4 stars. And then lastly, we have the much loved In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. So this is an odd one because I actually felt like this could be a 5-star read for me, and it ended up being a 4-star read, which is still super strong. But you know, when you think a book's going to be like one of your faves ever and it isn't, it just feels a bit of a letdown, doesn't it? Which is odd because it's just like expectations of a book and it's not really fair. So everybody knows about this. This is a memoir about an abusive relationship Carmen Machado was in with another woman, and this is written as lots of different short essays where they say sort of dream house as House in Florida, dream house as Here Comes the Bride, dream house as Pathetic Fallacy, dream house as The First Thanksgiving, all those things. And the dream house is the literal and the metaphorical house where the abuse took place. So there's sections of this I absolutely adored. I knew that I'd heard loads of people talk about the dream house as like choose your own adventure section, and that sounds a bit gimmicky, I think, when you hear people talk about it, but actually I found that section super powerful. I don't want to spoil anything about it because like you need to experience it yourself, but I think the commentary on choice and how trapped Carmen felt through that essay was excellent. I really loved it. I heard her do a reading, which I'll link below. I mean, she read one of my sort of favourite sections out in that reading, which is when her and her partner are driving home late one night and her partner is speeding and being awful. And when she arrives back at the house and sees, I think, some coyotes outside and sort of has this moment of peace. And I really loved that. So I'll link the video down below so you can see her read and hear her talk about it if you haven't already. So yeah, I did really enjoy this. I thought it was an excellent commentary. As you can see, I tabbed quite a few sections, but I think that the writing style just wasn't beautiful enough for me to want to give it 5 stars. I think there were sections that were really beautiful, but there was also just a lot of sections that were just really good and really solid, and just, you know, I've read a lot of memoirs that have been like exquisite, and this just wasn't there. So I still super enjoyed this. I still see why people rave about it, and I'm intrigued to sort of see what she does next. So yeah, I definitely recommend this one. So that is all the books I read in January. As I said, I'll be doing a couple more videos, hopefully later on this week, talking about some of the other books that I want to talk about more in depth. I'd love to know if you've read any of the books I mentioned, and if you have any recommendations, especially, like I said, for non-fiction books about like 5th, 6th century Britain. I feel really weird calling it Britain because, you know, it had such different names back then, but just for ease. Because yeah, I'm super intrigued, in particular if there's books about that time written by women, because I know that sort of history is really dominated by male voices, and I tend to find that women writers are better at writing about the female experience. So I'd be interested if you have any books to recommend by female authors about that time period. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!